What I want to do is step back and offer a little bit of larger context around the subject matter that you all are exploring here today. And in particular, I'm going to talk about things you already know. But I hope to show you that the familiar landscape, in this case of exponentials, is actually not so familiar, and that there's some real deep surprises under this. Now, I teach at Stanford, and I find and of course, just like folks here at Berkeley, when I walk into the classroom at Stanford, I realize I'm the dumbest person in the room. You know, the definition of middle-aged is I own a house in Silicon Valley that I could not afford to buy at market prices, and I'm a professor at a university that most assuredly would not admit me again as a student today. But I find even though the students did great on their SATs and their math achievements, there's a gap between understanding the math of exponentials and getting it here in your gut and in your heart. And the main message I have is that I think the proliferation of exponentials today is the single defining factor of the beginning of the 21st century. And it's a thing none of us talk about. So many things we talk about as causes and problems are really artifacts of exponential change. And I put this initial slide up. This is a diagram that credits back to King Hubbard in 1932, actually, just as a reminder that on exponential curves, there are multiple possible outcomes. Transformation, that's the happy curve. That's the only one you put on your business plan. And then the others down to collapse. And of course, the most likely is collapse. That's the profile of all of our lives. I don't care how much life extension you get, your life is going to follow a sigmoid curve unless you get hit by a safe, and then it'll be even steeper. So keep that in mind, that there are multiple outcomes in a given exponential curve. And we all know the mother of all exponential events, Gordon Moore, 1965. It was a marvelous observation, and I think you can summarize it that basically the microprocessor is the solvent leaching the glue out of our cultural institutions and our business institutions. And we're in this world of unlocked possibilities because of all the change that is happening. But again, it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to really get a sense more specifically of what this really means. So I have to leave here early today because I have an obligation. We're starting an executive program down at Singularity, and this evening we have dinner and a tour of the Computer History Museum, and I have to lead the tour. And I always pause to take a look at this device. It's one of my favorite computers. It's the Apollo guidance computer, 2 megahertz machine, 6 bits, 2K core rope memory. By the way, I love does anybody have any idea what core rope memory is? And you literally have to weave the memory. And they put all the software in core memory because they were worried the Russians would set off a nuclear device in the atmosphere and wipe the memory of the Apollo computer. Weighed 70 pounds, about twice the size of an Osborne. And by the way, all of the software was done by women. So next time somebody says a man stepped on the moon, just say, yeah, it's because a bunch of women got him there. The first thing Neil Armstrong did when he came back to Earth after he was out of quarantine was to go over and thank the woman who led that project. But I diverge. I have always wanted one of these. They're really nice. And I have a friend who has one besides the one in the museum. They didn't make a lot of them. There were probably, I think it was 50 versions and the like. And so, where do you go when you want an antique computer? eBay. And so I did last night. And I found it. I found one and I ordered it, but it didn't arrive in time. So this morning on my way over, I stopped at Walgreens and I got my own equivalent of the Apollo guidance computer. It's graduation season, and here's the card. And actually, I'm exaggerating. This is actually about 10x the power of the Apollo guidance computer. And to my annoyance, it actually cost me a lot. This is eBay last night, It's shipping 19 cents and it was $2. This cost me $7. And so now I'm trying to think of who I have as a friend that I can congratulate their little darling for having graduated from college. But you get the idea. Also, by the way, once upon a time, computer scientists were heroes. They got three humans to the moon and back with 4K of memory. And what are we doing with gigabytes? Social media and the like. It's proof of the decline of Western civilization. Anyway, I should push on because time's short. So we have the revolution, the deep transformations of the microprocessor, the magic of Moore's law and exponentials, creating all sorts of surprises, but it's not just processing. That the cost of solar power has fallen below grid parity, and that was a couple of years ago, way back in 2015. And so machines are coming out into the world, we're manipulating electrons, we're creating electric power, and it goes even farther. Who here is familiar with the Carlson curve? Carlson curve is the cost of decoding the human genome. And of course, in 2001, it was a little over $100 million. And this just plots it out. There's no point in plotting it out past 2015. The cost of decoding the human genome is decreasing faster than the curve of Moore's law. Another case, don't be an early adopter. Early adopters, they pay way too much for something that doesn't quite work. Just wait for a couple of turns of Moore's law. Well, but if you look, it's gone well below, to this year, it's now well below $100. If you plot this out to 2035, the price in 2035 of decoding the human genome will be 3 cents, which is a colleague of mine at Singularity likes to say that's a very interesting number because 3 cents is what it costs to flush a toilet in the United States. So if the cost of decoding a genome is the same as flushing a toilet, we will be decoding our genome every time we flush a toilet. Underscoring that we talk about deep transformation, but when you have change this fast, we can only begin to imagine what those transformations will be like. So now, we also have, I'm from Silicon Valley, everything's completely new. You've heard a lot about molecular manufacturing and molecular nanofactories and the like. Well, we've been doing that for a long time, too. It's called brewing. The oldest industry in the world was brewing beer, and that is just putting little microbes to work, and you don't even need a bunch of fancy equipment to do it. And we've gotten pretty good at it, and we've even co-evolved them to make even better beer. So exponential manufacturing is not new. And it's important to remind ourselves that exponentials, we're surrounded by natural examples. This wasn't an artifact of Silicon Valley. We're surrounded by exponentials. Another one is, what do you call 41 doublings over 271 days? Just shout it out. A baby, thank you. Yes, that's exponential doubling. We have other exponential doublings. It's called cancer. That exponential phenomena is the signature of life. All that fancy gear we have on Mars, all it's doing is looking for exponentials. So exponentials are all around us. They shape our lives and the like. But it goes even deeper than that because, of course, proliferating exponentials from technology are the great challenge today. And that's why I titled this Lost in the Exponential Forest. That I think we're in this ever-growing forest of exponential phenomena. And, to use the language of the Santa Fe Institute, it's a fitness landscape where the terrain is constantly changing. Things are appearing and disappearing, and, we don't even have a breadcrumb trail to follow. And, of course, there's a dark side to it. This is 1 millisecond into a certain form of doubling. I see some heads nodding, yes. Let me show you a couple of milliseconds later. This is Operation Crossroads. The other one was not Crossroads, it was one at the Trinity site. But exponentials are behind nuclear power. And so exponentials, of course, have a dark side, and they had a dark side long before Facebook and Zuckerberg and the like. And by the way, exponentials could be right in this room. They could be absolutely anywhere. Just show of hands, who knows where the exit is? Good. You are here. The Hayward Fault is about 90 meters that way. And it turns out that earthquakes are an exponential phenomena, that the moment magnitude scale is an exponential scale. So you see what we've got here, magnitude 1, magnitude 3. Well, the Hayward Fault, the last time the Hayward Fault let loose in 1868, it was a magnitude 7 quake. And it's way overdue. It is. I just walked up there during lunch, and you can see where the curbs are already, they're offset because the fault keeps creeping. And when the fault lets loose, the economic impact on the United States will be the equivalent of the economic impact of the Civil War in the 1860s, except it's going to happen in 15 seconds. This is why, I would make sure you know where the exits are. That's the bad news, is that it's an exponential scale. There is good news that earthquake frequency also follows a power law distribution. And so as it's called the Gutenberg-Richter law, and of course it's the San Andreas Fault a couple hundred miles south of here, that the occurrence of large-scale quakes drops off as a log function. That's why we don't have magnitude quakes every day. Here in the Bay Area, we have a couple of magnitude 2, 2.5s every week, and the planet gets one magnitude 8 maybe one time a year. So that's the good news about all of this. But by the way, the same rule applies to stock market crashes, to bank failures, and also to startups. That's why we don't have a Facebook or an Apple or a Google all the time. They're the magnitude 8 equivalents of innovation. In Silicon Valley, 80+% of all startups fail within 3 years. I know this. I started a company. We blew through a couple of tens of millions of dollars, left a smoking hole in the ground. It was my postdoc in entrepreneurship. 3% get hits, a fraction of a percent go on to become the big ones. So, every entrepreneur should pay attention to the power law curve before doing things. But meanwhile, there are other exponentials lurking out there on the horizon. And they're just lost. This is part of being lost in the exponential forest. We don't even pay attention to these. Population growth. You are here. Does that look sustainable to anyone? Right. And then I checked the Keeling curve last night just before it's not quite real time. They haven't uploaded any data since May 21st, but again, that's where we are way off on the right. Do we really need another chart to explain the climate crisis? It's kind of obvious. It's exponential, and we haven't had this happen. I mean, at least not in the last 8,000 years, we haven't had anything like this. So keep that in mind, because the problem is this. We are hopelessly linear thinkers, just absolutely pathetically linear thinkers. And latest data from February of this year bears it out. American consumer debt just hit $4 trillion in February 2019. The magic of compounding. How many people do not understand the magic of compounding? If they could understand this chart, everybody would pay off their credit card bill every single month. Or to put it another way, Hemingway's famous quip in The Sun Always Rises, well, sir, how did you go bankrupt? Gradually and then suddenly. It's just such a small little exponential doubling. Why, it's such a, if you want to be really mean to someone, give them a St. Bernard puppy. And they go, it's such a small little puppy. And then a couple of months later, they realize they have a dog the size of a horse. But let me give another example. See how big this room is. Okay, let me see how far back I can get. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, steps gets me to the back of the room and to the front. That's 30 linear steps. Now, how far will 30 exponential steps get me? And I'll give this a try. So, one, my next one is double. And go. Triple, and I'll end up in this lap, so I'll stop. So how far does 30 exponential steps get me? You're all good at math. Give me a number, sir. Huh?
4.
4 what?
4 steps.
4 space. No, how far? How much distance? If I'm 1 meter, I'm about 0.9 meters, so then it's 1.8, so 2, 4.
30 times you can most of the way to the sun.
Most of the way to the sun, a little far, 27 times around the earth. He's a futurist, so they do tend to be a little far. Keep that in mind. That's the difference. You know, it's the magic of compounding. You all, I'm sure, know the story of, King Kareem's chessboard and the like. We just can't get our heads around it. Even when we can do the math, it's really hard to understand what that's like. One of the things missing, since you all are concerned with language, we need a new exponential vocabulary. For example, the point in the curve, that's what matters most, right? And where's the inflection point? And you all know that is not the inflection point. The inflection point's a little higher. And in fact, that point on the curve, if you talk to mathematicians, that point has absolutely no mathematical significance. But there's some entrepreneurs in the room. Do you think that point on the curve, that where the bend is, does that have some significance? You betcha. If you're a startup, that's where you want to be. But we don't have a name for that point. And just to review sort of top-level rules of exponentials, each step is double the previous generation. The current step, thus, equals the total value of all the previous steps, and thus the last previous step is always at the halfway point. We are always at that point on the curve. So I took it on myself, thought, well, what do we call that? And I've been working at it. I've talked to a lot of friends. A good friend of mine is the former chair of the Harvard Math Department. I said, I need a term that's compelling but has no mathematical significance. And the two I've settled on, not sure which one's better, either critical point or transformation point. The point on the curve that is a critical point is the point where the exponential matters to you. And that can be different for different people and different for different companies. Because what I have found is most people don't see exponentials to begin with. There's that flat spot, nothing's happening, they aren't. Once you start looking for them, they're everywhere, and they're going to drive you absolutely crazy. And the trick is to figure out which exponentials are relevant. You all know the example of the allowance. I'm sure you've heard this many times. So to refresh your memory, the math smart kids, his parents say, okay, well, we should probably give you an allowance, and instead of giving the usual spoiled Gen Z, $20 a week or whatever, the son says, look, I'm a very modest child. My needs are very small. Just, give me a penny a week as a symbolic thing. And, maybe build a little inflation, so just, double it every week. And the unsuspecting parent says yes, and you all know what happens at about week 33. Their weekly allowance is greater than the complete net worth of Bill Gates. And so the question is, where is the critical point? Well, the critical point is when the parents realize they've been had. Now, if they're starting Berkeley graduate students and they're mathematically numerate, they might catch on in week 5. If they're Bill Gates, he might not notice until week 25. So the transformation point really depends entirely on what your circumstances are and what you're looking at. So that's the first thing. We need more vocabulary, and this is a good place to start. But an exponential pattern I've seen. At first, the future always arrives late. and also, incidentally, in unexpected ways. Most people get surprised by an exponential takeoff. Think about 1988, the year that Al Gore invented the internet. And it was actually 20 years old at that point. But everybody said, what's this thing and where did it come from? So most people don't notice. Innovators and academics, we all notice it earlier. We're aware that things are happening. And the price that we pay for that is we tend to overestimate the short term, that we think the future is going to arrive much, much more quickly. And the thing to keep in mind is this motto, which I first heard from a rancher who lived down the road from where I was as a kid here in California. He said, son, never mistake a clear view for a short distance. It's like being out in the Nevada desert on a ridgetop, looking across at the mountain range on the horizon. It's so close you could reach out and touch it. Except once you get on your horse and you start heading towards it, you realize it's one hell of a lot further away. Now, of course, in Silicon Valley, we make a business out of mistaking a clear view for a short distance. And among the worst offenders are the artificial intelligence community. It has a long history of overstatement. Herb Simon, one of the smartest people of the 20th century, machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do, 1965. And Marvin Minsky, who just passed away, within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. Yes. Someday when I die, I want to die in an artificial intelligence lab because everything there arrives late. Now the question is, are things different today? Is it now starting to arrive? Because the pattern here is we tend to overestimate the short term. Most ideas in Silicon Valley take 20 years to become an overnight success. And then our disappointment that things haven't arrived lead us to underestimate the long term. So you get hit coming and going. You're waiting around for something that doesn't happen, and just as you walk away, it starts to take off. Here's the antidote to that things take forever, nothing's happening, but the sign that you've got an approaching transformation point is listen for the Doppler shift. That, the sound of the whistle of a train coming down the tracks, the frequency goes up. The Doppler shift here with exponentials is all of a sudden things are happening faster than people expected. So as I shot, this was a really fun picture to try and take. My dog got in the way. I think she could almost see her in there. Objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. When things suddenly start arriving faster, we're in an exponential. And I'll give you an example from first experience. This is a picture I shot at the first DARPA Grand Challenge in May 2004. 150 miles, 21 teams, only 4 vehicles got any distance. And people thought that it was unbelievably bold of Tony Tether and DARPA to even propose the idea of this robotic race across the desert. Most of the robots did this. This cute little robot came out of the Jersey barriers in the back. You can just see him there. Came out, it looked left, it looked right, it thought for a second. Well, after this morning, I'm not going to say it thought. It processed for a second. It turned left and it died in a coyote bush, 30 feet from the start. It was like Monty Python. And here's the vehicle that was in front, sandstorm, and just moments, so here he is, it is about to cross the road. That's moments later, I took a picture of it driving through a barbed wire fence. I was part of a support team. I hopped in a helicopter. I was out at midpoint in the race, and we're all waiting for the robots to show up. And I was like, where are the robots? So pilot says, get on my Blackhawk. We'll go back and we find them. Here's sandstorm stalled out on the road 7 kilometers out. It died, and everybody else did worse. And everyone went, well, that was a really bold idea, but that was a complete failure. At the start, they thought, we'll never have robotic cars. But at the end of the race, they said, well, maybe by 2080, this will be practical, and maybe we should do it again. So now we go to the second DARPA Grand Challenge, 17 months later. That is Stanford's car, Junior, finishing the race. In the second Grand Challenge, 22 out of 23 finalists got farther than Sandstorm got in 2005, and 5 vehicles finished. And everyone went, whoa, oh, well, maybe we'll get these by 2050. So notice, 18 months passed, everybody just shaved 20 years off of their forecast. Then we get to the third grand challenge, and this is Stanford. We came in first. 25 months later, so 1.5 doublings of Moore's Law. This was the Urban Grand Challenge, where the vehicles not only had to finish the race, this was on a closed-down Air Force base in the Mojave. They had some stunt drivers very brave stunt drivers playing the role of pedestrians and other drivers. So the vehicles not only had to finish the race, they had to demonstrate they understood the California Vehicle Code. There was some other East Coast, Carnegie something, they won on a technicality, but we came in first at Stanford. That's another story. But 96-mile course, 11 finalists, 5 finished, and everybody said, this is amazing. We might get these by 2030. Maybe we'll get robotic cars by 2030. And then, October 9th, 2010, New York Times broke the story that Google had been driving self-driving cars on public highways over 100,000 miles. They'd even driven it down Lombard Street. And so, in fact, that thing everybody's talking about for 2030 in an experimental form arrived in 2010. And, by 2015, we have Google Street View cars or robotic cars on the streets. It's gotten so bad, so I'm down at NASA a lot. I made the mistake of cutting through the Google campus to get to NASA about a week ago, and I got stuck in a robotic traffic jam. I was the only car piloted by a human, and all the other cars at the four-way stop were robotic cars. And it turns out the traffic jam was my fault. Software. What happens is, so what do you do when you come to a stop sign? Just stop. Yeah, except you don't. You don't stop. You stop, and then you roll forward a little bit, and you stop, and you look at the other person to see what their automotive body language is. And every time you roll forward and stop, the robots reset, and it confused them. So I think I'm responsible for about 4 lines of code in the Google stop. Anyway, to continue onward, so we get 2015. We get, Super Cruise appears in 2015 as well. If ever there was a case to not be an early adopter, this is it. I mean, when you had an early adopter of a desktop computer, it'd, quote, blow up. Well, when these fail, they're lethal. So, don't pay too much for something that doesn't quite work. Let me give you another example that happens to be from Tesla. This is a chart of the battery costs over time in kilowatt hours. And you see all the forecasts. This was a forecast made in 2010. And you can see that really optimistic purple one would be down to $50 per kilowatt by 2030. Tesla hit that in January 2017. This is a case where the future is arriving a whole lot faster than people think. That's an indicator. When the future arrives faster than everybody's forecasting, it means that we're really riding that exponential curve. And by the way, we all know, I don't have a slide for this, but we all know that all the climate change forecasts are wrong, right? Does anybody disagree with me? Every single climate change forecast is wrong. They're right on the trend. Every single one is wrong because they all got it wrong about how quickly it would happen. Take a look, without exception. So in my personal life, I did stuff on climate change reports when I was at a think tank back in the 80s. I happened to be part of a search and rescue team. I was up at the campfire for a couple of days as part of a FEMA task force recovering, searching for bodies, basically. And here I am, and all the, the smoke and dust and everything else, and I look back and I thought, gracious. Well, I actually used a different term, but I won't say it here. This is a climate event. This is an event that in the 1980s I was writing about what happened by 2050, and here it is, I'm in the middle of a climate event in 2018. So keep that in mind. Some negative things are happening faster. But let me get to the key point of this talk and start to wrap up here. Here's the question. Has AI reached its critical point? And if so, what's next? The business plans say it's all happy transformation, but there are other outcomes. If in my business forecasting, I think of a cone of uncertainty that extends out from the present. And just because something's going up, the cone of uncertainty is almost 180 degrees here, depending on how you look at it. But, thinking about it, perhaps this was the deep learning critical point. I don't know. DeepMind winning the first Go competition, or maybe a better one was 2 years later in 2017. When KGA said, the first time I lost to Google DeepMind, it was just playing better than me, but I knew what it did. When he played it the second time, this is what he said. Last year was still quite human-like. This year, it became like a god of Go. I have no idea how it beat me. He just was totally puzzled. So, maybe that is. And we can talk about it. But let me pull back to first assumptions. Whenever I look at a field, I always say, where did this thing come from? And when I hear a term, I've hung around AI companies since 1982, 83. But who here knows the origins of the term AI?
It's on the first page of Hobbes' Leviathan.
Yeah, that doesn't count. Yale, you can take the professor out of Yale, but you can't take Yale out of the professor. He's right. Dartmouth, go ahead.
Herbert Simon's book, The Sciences of the Artificial.
Getting warm, okay. Who's, yes, ma'am.
John McCarthy, Stanford.
Yep.
Field, and he said he wanted to differentiate the name from cybernetics, so he called it artificial intelligence.
God bless you. Are you at Stanford?
No.
Good. She is absolutely right. Give her a hand. This is absolutely dead right. And so this was, Norbert Wiener was pushing cybernetics. McCarthy pushed AI. Was this a philosophical distinction? Now, I'm a little hesitant using the word philosophical here because I carefully listened to all the presentations that this morning, took about 10 pages of notes. I think I understood about 3% of what was said, so it may be malpractice per se for me to invoke the word philosophy. But, so you have this distinction. It sounds very highfalutin, and you're absolutely right as far as the story goes. I'll bet you don't know the real reason.
Because everybody hated Norbert Wiener.
Okay, I'm going to stop making Yale jokes. You're absolutely right. Norbert Wiener said, McCarthy, you're a commie. And McCarthy said, Wiener, you're a fascist. There is no goddarn way I'm going to use cybernetics as the label for my talk. And my field, I'm going to give it a new name. That's how we ended up with artificial intelligence. Now, one piece of advice, I've said this to friends at the Pentagon, why does the Pentagon always have code phrases for their projects like Operation Enduring Freedom or Operation Big Bomb or whatever? And I said, never pre-announce your jailbreak. Call it Operation Fluffy Bunny or something that doesn't get attention. And artificial intelligence was a terrible term because everybody got really interested. Biology, how stupid to call cloning. They should have just called it something really dull and boring. That's how we got the internet, because packet switching doesn't sound sexy. And it allowed innovators to work in peace without being distracted by other people. So if you start a project, pick the most boring possible name you can think of. But this terminology stuff gets pretty quickly to be a little bit like arguing over a map while you're lost in the middle of an exponential forest. What is AI? Is it narrow classical AI, or is it artificial and general intelligence? I mean, we have narrow AI everywhere today. Proof of narrow AI is my spell checker. And it's also proof that the field is not advancing. I don't know if you all have noticed this. I've got a good 30 gigs of RAID in my home phone closet. I got computers, massively powerful machines at home, and my spell checker is worse than it was in 1995. I spend more time fighting with my spell checker And of course, in their wisdom, Apple and everybody else, you cannot turn your spell checker off. It is proof that, classical AI is everywhere and it still sucks. That's a technical term. Or, maybe it's AGI. So when everybody talks about AI, it's like, well, what the hell are we talking about? Which one? I would just close with this. If we're going to make sense of being lost in this exponential forest at the intersection of what you're thinking about this week, maybe this is the real question we should be asking. Is it AI or IA? Who here registers on IA? I want to talk to you afterwards. Terry, just like you to put a ringer in the audience, So artificial intelligence, John McCarthy, will machines replace human cognition? IA is intelligence augmentation. Machines are our companions. They will enhance human cognition. That was the vision of Doug Engelbart, who read Vannevar Bush's article, As We May Think, in the July-August 1945 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, decided to dedicate his life to it, and went ahead and started the Augment Project at SRI. If you haven't read it, this paper, Augmenting Human Intellect, October 1962, is something everybody should read, and that led to the mother of all, what's referred to as the mother of all demos that took place 50 years ago in December in San Francisco. I won't go over it, that's why you have Wikipedia. If you're not familiar with this, do a deep dive on Doug's work. Doug's work arguably has had more impact on our lives than John McCarthy's work, both Stanford researchers. So I'll wrap up there and just say maybe we need to go back to first principles. Think about terms. Think about what the words we're missing. I'm always suspicious. Whenever I hear a new term, I stop and I not only ask what it means, I ask where does it come from? And again, I'm in a room full of philosophers and linguistics type. I don't need to tell you that the word you use has meaning. But I'll close with one other wild card. Is it AI? Is it IA? How fast will artificial intelligence go? Maybe this is the ultimate wild card. Somewhere, someone is going to get a free dinner in Stockholm answering the question of whether P equals NP. But that, of course, is another story entirely. So keep this in mind, that we're riding up these exponential curves. We're lost in an exponential forest, and the outcomes are never a foregone conclusion. And by the way, so show of hands, who thinks that transformation is the most common outcome? Right. Who thinks, and I'll just go, so raise your hand. Collapse? Good. Recovery? Steady state? Good. So what is one thing that arguably really is on a transformative curve with no end in sight? Life? You're an optimist. Okay, I'll take that under consideration. How about another one that's just like a total no-brainer? Entropy reduction. You guys are too smart. Simple. It might even be in the name of this conference. Information. Thank you. Who said information? Not you again, I hope. Thank you. Okay. So let it be known that the women in this room were making the smartest statements in this hour. That information is the only thing, arguably, that I've seen that convincingly goes all the way up the transformative curve. That's how you can reach me. I'll stop.